Hello and welcome. This is Creatively Torn, a channel where I mostly talk about books, but sometimes don't. Today this is going to be one of the crucial videos that any booktuber must make at some point in their career. This is my top 10 books of all time. This is the first time I've done this video and will likely not be the last time. I do expect this to change quite a bit. But then even in the next year or so, even more so afterwards, as I read more books. But as of now, I think I've constructed enough titles to properly start with a top 10. These will not be any particular genre. These are all different categories. They are all fiction, but they vary from fantasy to sci-fi to literary fiction. So I don't have enough for a top 10 genre list yet, but maybe in the future I will do that. But for now, this is just a top 10 overall list. These are not in any order. I can't rate them, I don't think. Saga's gonna help me with this video. There's a few on here that she likes. I know there's at least one of them. So most of these will not come as a surprise. I have talked about many of them on the channel within the past year or so. And most of them, well not most of them, but many of them I have read in the past year, so that's kind of telling. So the first one on my list is one that I did read last year. One that I have seen the movie of before and quite like. The first one is Life of Pi by Yann Martel. This is a very good book. I did a review of it on this channel quite a while ago now. It's not very good, but the book is really good. I really quite enjoyed it. Really well written. Has a lot of symbolism and nice themes. Really good ending. I think the last quarter of the book or so is really good. Great characters. I mentioned the movie adaptation, which is also one of my favorite movies of all time, which just adds to the spectacle. The next one I want to mention is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This is one of the first sci-fi novels ever written. It's also very much paired into the horror and gothic fiction categories as well. I read this a couple of years ago and I really quite enjoyed it. It's a lot different than any of the movies, except for maybe the Kenneth Branagh movie in the 90s. But as for the classic interpretations of Frankenstein, it's quite different. It's much slower, much more atmospheric, and more character-based, more introspective. There's not a whole lot of action in the book at all. It's more a lot of philosophical musings about creation and science and death and all kinds of things like that. As a whole, I think it's one of the best horror or sci-fi books ever written. Definitely one of my favorites. Definitely one that I need to reread here soon, so that I can appreciate it even more than I did the first time. I will be including a couple of series on this list. Just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to put the overall series as opposed to individual books in a series. But maybe I'll mention my favorite book in the series just as an aside. So the first of those series is going to be the Dark Tower series by Stephen King. This is a fantasy series I've talked quite a lot about on the channel. I read most of it last year, quite enjoyed it. So for those who don't know, the Dark Tower is a kind of a fantasy series by Stephen King, but it's very much a series that defies genre. Each book really is different. It encompasses sci-fi, western, horror, fantasy. It's very well written. It's got some really good characters in this series as well. Lots of great quotes and great moments. Definitely a wild ride from books 1 to 7. One that is quite unique and unlike anything you've ever read. Definitely deserves a spot on my top 10. If I had to pick a favorite for the Dark Tower series, that would of course be Book 3, The Wastelands. I've talked about this a few times. It's easily my favorite of the series. I think it's the most well written, the most complete book, even though it's not complete. If you read it, you know what I mean there, but for the most part, it's one of the more complete stories. It contains a lot of great characters, a lot of new characters, a lot of really fun quotes, great atmosphere. Next up is a very recent entry that I've read. That's a weird sentence. This is a very recent book that I read that I saw. I've also talked about this on the channel. I made a review for it. That, of course, is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. It's a historical fiction adventure tale about revenge and morality and things like that. It's a very good book, one of the great classics to get your hands on, or whatever, I don't know. It's a really good book. I mentioned a lot of the details in my review, which is not the worst, I will say. So maybe I will add a link here or something. Anyways, The Count of Monte Cristo is very good, definitely one of my favorites. One of my favorite classics so far, very easy to read, really good characters, very enthralling narrative, and one that I definitely recommend. Here is another series. This is another fantasy series. This one I've read a couple of times now. First read several years ago. This is the Harry Potter series. Obviously, you know what Harry Potter is, most likely. If you haven't read it, you know about it, or you've seen the movies. So the books are very good. They're one of my favorites, obviously. Well written. Very, very welcoming setting. It really draws you into the book. All the characters are great. All the books are good. If I did have to pick a favorite from the series, it would be Book 7, The Deathly Hallows. It's just a really wild ride from beginning to end, and a really nice, if not perfect, way to end the series. Next up is a classic dystopian sci-fi. This is from George Orwell, 1984. Of the dystopian classics I've read so far, I'd say 1984 is the best. It's the most well fleshed out universe. It's got, I wouldn't say endearing characters, but well thought out characters. Ones that you can understand, per se. I think the overall world is just the most well thought out, the most memorable of all the ones that I've read so far. Contains a lot of great ideas and great themes about the future of governments and controlling information and things like that. This is another one that I'm sure you are aware of if you haven't read it. You've heard quotes or references to the book. So obviously a very good book, and one that I do recommend if you haven't gotten a chance to read it yet. And of course, I cannot make this list without my favorite book from last year. That is White Fang by Jack London. I did make a video for this one as well. It's kind of mid-tier, but I did really enjoy the book. It's written from the viewpoint of White Fang, a wild wolf dog, and it goes about, and the story kind of goes around, is sort of built around his life, his coming of age, and his acclimating to society and things like that. It's a really good story. Got a lot of highs and lows, a lot of dark points, and a lot of brighter points in the wolf's life and also in the story. So it's a very good tale, one that I quite enjoyed reading last year, and is definitely on this list for a reason. While we're on the subject of animals and pets, this is Pet Sematary. This is one that I read last year for the first time, despite having seen the movie a few times over the course of my life and quite enjoying it. I think the book is one of his more well-written stories, really concise narrative, strong enough characters, good ideas and plot, great ending. One of his more disturbing books as well. That is Pet Sematary. Moving on to another of the great American classics here. This is Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. This is a book that I read first in junior high, and I reread it again last year, and it was even better than I had remembered. It's a very good story, a lot of really memorable characters, lots of great quotes, lots of good ideas in here. Again, this is one that most people are aware of. Even if you haven't read To Kill a Mockingbird, you're probably aware of what it's about. So suffice it to say it's a really good book, and if you haven't read it so far, then you definitely should. And that leads us to the last book on the list, and that is going to be the most recent book that I've read. This one is Dune by Frank Herbert, which I just recently got done reading. Still not quite sure my overall thoughts on it, but I think it's one of the better books that I have read, and I think it's good enough to include on this list for now. Whether it stays here in the future, I'm not sure. But as of now, I think it's one of the best sci-fi books I've read, and one of the better fantasy books that I've read. Really enjoyed the writing style here. Lots of grand ideas and lots of overarching themes and things that play in the story here. Very atmospheric, kind of slow at times, but it's not altogether that boring, I don't think. It's obviously been a very influential book in the sci-fi genre, having lent ideas to several other franchises in the genre and even outside the genre. It's spawned a couple of movies, the most recent of which I have seen. I haven't seen any of the other ones yet, but I have seen the most recent one, and I quite enjoyed it. So I do recommend reading the book and watching the movie both, if you haven't done so already. So that is my list for my top 10 favorite books of all time. The first edition, I'll say. I do plan on making more of these in the future once my tastes eventually do evolve. So that's all I got for now. Thank you for watching, and let's get into the list properly. The first one I want to mention is... Yeah? Really? Hi. What? What?